Okay, that was an incredibly intense episode of Falcon and the Winter Soldier. I want to talk about three things in this review video. First, I want to talk about the steadfastness of Sam and how he's continually evolving his outlook on the situation before him. Secondly, I want to talk about our running theme, the ghost of Steve Rodgers. Finally, I think it's time for us to address the spiraling nature of John Walker here. First things first, spoiler alert. Keep that in mind as we go through this review. Now, in my last review episode, I started talking a bit about how I thought that the series was becoming a little bit too complex for me. Now, I don't mean complex in terms of grasping what's going on. It's still very linear and it makes sense overall, the plot and whatnot. I mean complex in that good and evil were becoming so intertwined that it was starting to create almost a kind of viewer fatigue. Now, I want to be very clear here. I'm not saying that it isn't entertaining and engaging still. It very much is. But the biker series Sons of Anarchy was also entertaining and engaging, and incredibly suspenseful and complex and all of that. But you knew that going into the series, and you knew what you were getting with every episode of Sons of Anarchy. Whereas with a Marvel series, I think there is a part of you that is anticipating a kind of clarity of goodness at some point. Now, this is where Sam comes into play here in this episode. I think Sam is starting to get a kind of clarity of vision of the world and the events around him. And the more complex that it actually becomes, the more Sam tries to pull in a kind of simplicity of what's in front of him. And that will come back into play when we talk about Steve Rodgers a little bit. There's an interesting parallel going on here in this series with one of my favorite stories, The Lord of the Rings. Of course, in The Lord of the Rings, you have the one ring to rule them all, right? And in the Falcon and Winter Soldier, it's almost like every vial is a kind of one ring from which you can test a person's yearning for power, in a sense, and what power would do to them. If you watch the episode, you'll remember that at one point, Zemo looks at the vials on the floor, and you can tell that he's starting to think, should I take it or not? That kind of a thing. And he ultimately just smashes the vials, at least most of them. Then when he's sitting on the couch trying to, get the dent out of his forehead from John Walker's shield, he asks Sam, would you take the vial, or have you ever been tempted by it or considered it? And Sam is very clear about saying, no, I wouldn't do it, period. Now, one of the things that I really like about that scene between Zemo and Sam is I do believe that Zemo actually feels a tremendous amount of admiration for Sam's clarity that he wouldn't take the vial, he wouldn't accept the super serum. So why wouldn't Sam take the super serum? Right? He's a wonderful person. He's a very good person like Steve was. I think it comes down to Sam understanding that the power you receive from the serum is actually quite limiting. I'm going to make another reference to another film that I loved, which was the 1982 Conan the Barbarian with Arnold Schwarzenegger and James Earl Jones. In that movie, it talks about the riddle of steel. And James Earl Jones's evil character, Thulsa Doom, actually clarifies what the riddle of steel is for Conan. It's basically this. Everybody thinks the sword, steel, is strong, but flesh is actually stronger. And the way Thulsa Doom gets that message across is he asks one of his, many cultish followers to just step off a cliff. He just says, come to me. And she steps off the cliff and she just splats right on the floor. Now, what is the purpose of that? The purpose is that it's not through the sword that James Earl Jones's character, Thulsa Doom, is able to move and defeat, cities. It's through his ability to manipulate and move humanity toward a specific goal. So, flesh is stronger when you can move human beings toward a specific goal, good or bad. I think Sam really understands this point. The serum is like steel. Yes, it's strong, great. In a one on one battle, it's wonderful to have, of course, but it's nothing compared to the ability to move people toward a common goal. Which is why I think he's not so much worried about Carly's, extra 20 vials of super serum as much as he's worried about the way she's coalescing the people around her and then moving them toward an ever growing problematic vision of their role in making the world a better place. Now that takes us to our running theme of the ghost of Steve Rodgers. And once again, Stevie seems to be haunting everyone here. One of the main problems, of course, is not just the approach that Steve Rodgers took in a given situation. The real problem with this episode appears to be a chemical one more than anything. How is it possible that Steve was able to resist that power amplification of himself, right? Steve never sought out great power for himself, and yet it continually seems to be the case that the serum has that effect on both Carly and John Walker. I think, of course, one of the big differences is that Steve was never taking it for himself, quite honestly. He was taking it to try to help win a war against an easily definable evil, right? Nazis / Red Skull, Hydra Force. Those were easily definable evils. There was no complexity there. We needed to stop them, period. In this episode, there's a conversation between Carly and one of her, fellow flag smasher mates, in which they once again discuss this idea of how the world is different. Everything is so much more complex than it used to be. Therefore, we need complex solutions. And if you're carefully watching, you'll note that of course, parallels the speech that Sam gives at the very beginning of all of this, when he talks about the world is different. It's much more complex. And in some way, their idea is that like a Steve Rodgers approach doesn't really fit. However, that's exactly when you need it the most. Now, this isn't to say that there isn't complexity and nuance in Carly's vision, right? Her frustration is very real. The human spirit can only be bent back so far before one of two things actually happens, right? It snaps and breaks, or it violently comes forward and takes out whatever's in front of it without care. I think what Steve would say is that the more complex that the ethics become in a given situation, the more you actually have to simplify to what's just simply in front of you. And Sam does that quite well here, especially in his decision to convince the rest of the team, Lamar, John Walker, Bucky, Zemo, and himself, to convince everybody that, listen, the greater good actually right now is to try to convince Carly, without trying to, fight her, convince her that what she's doing is problematic for these reasons. That's a very Steve Rodgers thing to do. Sometimes it is as simple as doing something good that's right in front of you, whether it's smiling at someone to brighten their day, helping them with their groceries, or even just opening the door for someone. These little events of goodness that we create in the world can sometimes have great impacts and reverberations on the world around us. Okay, so we have to talk about John Walker here. I don't think it's a huge surprise to anybody what is happening. I think we all sort of saw it coming, or at least possibly heading that way. In some ways, his spiraling out of control does mirror Carly's, right? Both of them feel frustrated by their lack of agency, right? Their lack of power to make right what they know in their hearts is good. The problem, of course, is that their vision of good has been corrupted by the very power that they wield. And so Walker's terribly violent moment at the end comes out of the trauma of losing the one person who really did see him as Captain America. I don't think the regular civilians ever saw John Walker as Captain America, right? They saw him more as a kind of symbolic stand-in. But Lamar really did seem to believe in the good within him and in John Walker's ability to actually live up to that standard of Captain America. Therefore, once Lamar is gone, there is no one left behind anymore here in John Walker's world to hold him accountable to that high standard, right? Or no one there to be his conscience from which he can kind of check himself. So what you end up with is a man acting out of pure frustration and rage, and in front of the whole world. Now, as I said in a previous episode, what I think the writers in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier are doing particularly well is they understand that in order to create compelling tragedy, you must first create great heights of humanity. And it's clear at the beginning of this series that John Walker is a good to decent, dare I say, even a great man, right? He's a war hero, and clearly he wanted to do good by taking on this mantle of Captain America. And he has a loving wife as well, at home, which, by the way, I'm thinking that his wife is going to make an appearance here pretty soon to try to remind him of his humanity again. Now, the writers have created a great man, and they've created a great fall. The question is, what are they going to do with that? Now, for me personally, I do think that the series is still going a bit too dark here at this point. I would like to see them start to reconcile some of this ethical complexity sooner rather than later, but I recognize that that's just me. So, were you surprised by this turn of John Walker? Also, do you like the trajectory of the series still in terms of its darkness? Let me know in the comments below.